what is a B movie? Why am I talking about B movies? So what does the B mean? So simply, the B in B movie doesn't really mean anything. But if you're wondering like what is a B movie, Mike, then simply these are movies that people would describe as bad movies. These are movies where like it's usually low budget, so some people think the B means like a budget movie, but it's not actually true. So simply, the B is actually because you have an A movie and then you have a B movie. It's like the second movie, right? And all of this stuff comes from like in the 1920s, when movies actually became a thing, like, you know, you would go to a cinema and watch a movie. They really used like a kind of matinee style. And what that means is there's the premium movie, the movie you really want to see that would bring everyone in. But because they were really trying to convince people to come to the cinema and watch films, they would have this B movie on the side that was like, you know, extra bonus value for your ticket. You know, you're paying $2 for a ticket, but you know, there's two movies, so it's basically $1, you know. So it was just a way of maximizing value. So they were basically like a side attraction, which was like, they would run one movie, then they would run the B movie afterwards or before. And because of that, because it was just this kind of filler extra thing, they didn't really take B movies very seriously whatsoever. It was just the secondary movie that no one was really there to watch, but it was like an extra content kind of thing. And actually, as you kind of go through the timeline, you'll realize that like B movies are quite interesting because they show or demonstrate like different themes or genres at the time. So actually, B movies were often called a genre movie, and genre meaning like horror, mystery, sci-fi, romance, these different types of films, right? And so B movies in the beginning didn't really have much of a story. They were just, it was more of a, this is a horror film, and that was it. There wasn't anything like in terms of plot. So you get these kind of monster movies, and it's, if you go back and you start looking at the B movies from different times, you can see actually quite a lot about mostly American culture, because that's where all of this stuff was happening. So for example, 1930s, that a lot of the B movies were like about, you know, the mysteries of like the East and unexplored Africa, and it was like, imagine a lot of people had never seen, because again, we're talking about the very beginning of film and camera and cinema and things like that. People had never seen Africa, Asia, South America, Europe, even in some cases. And so you had a lot of this kind of King Kong kind of apes and unexplored worlds, and like, look at these interesting like native people, stuff like that. And that was like the kind of side attraction of its time. And then interestingly, in like things like the 1940s, for example, women were largely the kind of the bad guy. And coincidentally, this is also the 1940s was a big time for like more women's rights, and especially in America, women being more like, you know, vocal and wanting like equal pay and things like this, and like vote, the right to vote, the right to have a bank account, which wasn't happening at all until the 60s even. So because it's like a reflection of the time, the 40s, you had like women and single women. Like you have these insane B movies like The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, who's literally, the story is about a woman who just is enormous, 50 foot tall, and of course she's a woman and she can't be trusted, so she's just smashing like New York or something. It's crazy, but that's what this kind of side attraction was of the time, and that it reflects the kind of fears or the interests of the culture. And then there was a kind of significant switch. So the 1950s, for example, you had stuff where things started to go more to like westerns. And interestingly, they realized at this point, because cinema was very much more about like, they took themselves really seriously. And just to jump back, in the beginning, like this, so this would be the 1920s, for example, like Dracula and all these monster movies. But in the beginning, directors in cinema were trying really, really hard to compete with theatre, and like cinemas were really looked down on, and like it was this really kind of like low class thing to do. Of course, the theatre was far more sophisticated and much better. So for a long, long time in the beginning of cinema, directors were really trying to push and be like, no, I am a talent. I am like, I'm a talented director and I'm very serious. So the A-list movies were like very, very intense, very story driven, lots of like novel kind of stuff. But then in the 50s, they discovered that people didn't really want that. And actually what people were more interested in was a lot of violence and shooting and action and the kind of stuff we know about now. So in the 1950s, B movies actually started to become A movies. Stuff like these genre movies, like a horror film or a Western, switched, and actually they were making these A-list movies, which became really big. So Man Without a Star is an example of like a Western, very low budget, but that's what people wanted to see. They wanted to see like more action. So the things kind of switched. And then in the 60s, we saw like within cinema, especially with B movies, more focus on marketing and the kind of stuff that we see now. There's a guy I'll mention later about this, but marketing is in like, they'd have these insane posters and they'd have this like, you'll die from terror and all this mad stuff that was happening. Like at the time, telling people like it's sold out, and it was really just about tickets, and they were really much more focused on making money. And instead of trying to tell a story, it was more about like, get as many bums on seats as possible and make big cash. And then cinema culture really shifted as like it became the norm. B movies kind of switched to like basically porn. So in the 70s, they were really pushing it, especially more with like hyper sexualized stuff. You also had a lot of like blaxploitation films and stuff like that, where they were trying to target like Black American audiences, and it was all just like, they call it skin flicks. So basically just a lot of nudity and just a lot of like graphic violence, and it was just as hardcore as it could be. Like they're always pushing the line of like, this X-rated movie, and like, it's banned in Europe, all of this stuff. Then actually in the 80s, they kind of destroyed their own industry, basically. In the 80s, it was like a money-making machine at this point, and it really didn't matter what the story was. It was just, you would just be tricking people to go and see your film, and you could like convince people, clever advertising, clever marketing. They did some crazy stuff in the 80s with films, and they just started reusing these genre films. So 80s B movies were like kind of copying the 1930s or 1940s B movies, like Dracula, vampires, werewolves. All of this stuff was basically just being used again. So there wasn't much originality, but it was just more focused on like, I want to see lots of like naked women, and I want monsters, and I want lots of blood, and like, there you go. And we'll get people to, it's like a popcorn movie, just no thinking whatsoever, just violence and tits. And then pretty much like the industry was struggling, and the thing that saved it was VHS. So in the 90s, it became easier than ever to like, there was a whole new revenue thing. You didn't need to have your your film displayed in a cinema to make money from it. Anyone could make a movie, and you could actually make a lot more sales on VHS tape, and it could be distributed easier. And so there was this huge run in the 90s where we saw like loads and loads of B movies just come up and just make it as quickly as possible, sell it for like video rental, things like that. So there was a kind of, as it was dying, it just kind of peaked up again in the 90s, and then more or less collapsed in the noughties. So with DVD and things like that, this trend kind of carried on, where just any old shit would do. To be honest, I would say like the noughties is probably one of the worst periods for like B movies. If you're looking for movies in this like era, they're usually really bad because they'd be making these things in like 2 weeks, straight on a DVD, copy, send, like poor quality. And then interestingly, in the 2010s, because editing software became much more accessible, you didn't need a whole studio to make these movies. Like you could actually produce a decent movie at home. And especially like CGI, 3D effects became more accessible. People could do that. 2010s actually, the quality of the B movies kind of jumped significantly. Not all, obviously, but things like Sharknado is a great example, where you could take these insane ideas and people would run with it, and as it turned out, it became a massive hit. Terrible movie, but very funny to watch. And that kind of brings us to modern day, where B movies now have become their whole other thing. They have their own platforms. Sci-Fi and Shudder are like their own platforms for B movies, where you can just watch just horror films, just sci-fi films. And we're kind of in this point where things like Amazon Prime and Netflix are desperate for content. So we've actually come full circle. And just like the reason B movies existed in the first place was to kind of like extra content, extra value for your cinema ticket. The same thing is happening now with the platforms. Like Netflix just needs as many movies as possible. So there's another emergence now of B movies. So the big question, now you know what a B movie is, kind of, and the timeline. Why do I love them? Is the question that so many friends have asked as I've made them watch these terrible, terrible movies. Why not watch an A-list movie? Why not watch something